For anyone who's new to WILPF, we are the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, an international feminist organization with a history of more than 100 years of campaigning for peace, freedom, and women's rights. And today we're delighted to give a very warm welcome and to introduce you to Helen Pankhurst. Now, you may know Helen as granddaughter of Sylvia Pankhurst, one of the leaders of the British suffragette movement and a WILPF pioneer. Sylvia campaigned against war, and she ran a centre for working class women in London's East End throughout World War I, and later she campaigned against colonialism, fascism, and nuclear weapons. Helen picks up these threads in her own life as an international development and women's rights activist and writer involved in human rights and climate justice activism. Helen is also senior advisor at the NGO Care International UK and a professor at Manchester Metropolitan University and the first Chancellor of the University of Suffolk. She was involved in the film Suffragette, and her book, Deeds Not Words, which Helen Martins can show you, it was published in 2018. We've timed this event to coincide with the United Nations Human Rights Day, which I'm sure most of you know is on the 10th of December. And this is also the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So I shall try to enable Helen to share with you some of her experiences of activism. And we would like this to be an interactive question and answer session. So I hope our conversation will stimulate you to ask Helen particular questions. And I think we've allowed plenty of time for this. So thank you again, Helen, for agreeing to spend time with us today. And here's your first question. Now, the work of your grandmother, Sylvia, resonates particularly with WILPF's work. What would you like to tell us about the legacy of your family heritage and something specifically about Sylvia's activism?
Thank you. Thanks very much. Delighted to be here with you. Very disconcerted to see myself on large. I'm going to change the view so that I can focus on you, not me. Hide self-view, much better. Oh, didn't work. Gone. Good. Yeah, so really delighted to be here with you all, with everything that WILPF stands for. It's so much part of what I've been doing and interested in, and that comes directly from my legacy, and that comes from Sylvia in particular, but also because of Sylvia, I was born and brought up in Ethiopia, so it all comes from there in a way. Very interested in your questions and all of that. We have some questions set up, but please do start putting anything in the chat box and we'll come back to it later on. So your first question was around Sylvia and something in particular about her. I mean, Helen Martins just showed you my book called Deeds Not Words, which is, I don't know whether you can see because I can't see myself now, but I'm gesticulating how big it is. This book of Sylvia's, written by Rachel Holmes, and again, I'm hoping you can see it, is a tome and a half, and that's a summary of Sylvia's life, which was so amazing on so many levels. I think Sheila, you listed some of those, but you know, feminist, working on the intersection between gender and class, very aware of issues around racial inequalities, aware of sexual ones as well, though didn't campaign on it. It just wasn't something that could be done, I think, at the time, but not blind to it. interested in the local to the global. You went to very much part of the internationalism of the beginning of the 1900s, you know, just kind of aware of that as an issue, of the importance of people coming together, anti-colonialism, anti-racism, you name it, pacifism in the First World War, a feeling that one needed to speak out in the Second World War and that pacifism wasn't the solution at the time of the Second World War. So intricate thinking as well. But you asked me for one point, and maybe the one point that is often not known about is that Sylvia had erected a anti-war memorial in the back of her house in Woodford, an anti-war memorial. If you think about all of the war memorials there are around the world, hers was the first, and I don't know how many more there are, but it's not a very common thing. And she did it in 1935, and she dedicated it, the words she used on it, if I can find them, those who in 1932 upheld the right to use bombing aeroplanes. And this was an ironic reference to the participants of the 1932 World Disarmament Conference who voted to maintain the right to use aerial bombing in warfare. The point being, if they had voted to not allow that to happen, it would have quashed that whole movement around war related, around air bombing. And this was also in the context of the Mussolini's use of aeroplanes to use chemical weapons on Ethiopia. So that as an idea, an anti-war memorial, I think really interesting, unusual, and also possibly speaks to her interest in the link between activism and culture and monuments. And she was a painter, and I love the fact that we started with some music, and I think that link between music and activism is a very strong one, between culture and images is a really strong one.
Very good. I really tune in with all of that. Going on to what Sylvia was campaigning centrally about, do you think having the vote has been transformative for women? Has it contributed to equality and social transformation? What are your thoughts about the countries where women don't have the right to vote, or where voting is done at gunpoint or under coercion? And yet here in the UK, we still have women who don't vote.
Yeah, there's a lot there. I mean, if we start with why politics, why the vote, I think that they felt, you know, 1903 when the WSPU was formed, and well before that with the suffragist movement, they felt that without the vote, that in a way it was the ground level of women being treated equally, women having importance, women's voice counting, women being able to engage in political activism. So it was the basis, the first step upon which everything else could be structured, that without that, you didn't have anything. You didn't have that external possibility of a voice and influence outside the home. So that foundational logic to the fight for the vote, I think it was important, is important, continues to be important. But even then, they never felt it was the be-all and end-all. It was a tool for other things. And even as they were campaigning for the vote, many suffragists and suffragettes and the family were involved in all sorts of other campaigns as well. I think it's sad that there are still, and sad such a poor, weak word, but it's unacceptable that we still have so many countries where people can't vote, don't have that democratic right to engage, that first step towards political engagement. Not that democracy is wonderful, but you know, it's the best, it's better than the alternative. So very much aware of the limitations of the democratic political system that we have, and therefore the vote itself in most parts of the UK with the first past the post system, for example. So a lot of skepticism about the whole machinery that exists. But I do come back to the fact that it is foundational. And so for people that don't have that ability to express themselves in that first way, in that first step, it is I can't find the words, but it is unacceptable. The fact that we're still there, you know, more than 100 years later, there's still countries that don't have it, or where it's nominal. And we'll come back to some of this because you're going to ask me about some of the work that I do with Centenary Action, I know. But the last point that you asked was around women that don't vote. And again, I would like to come back to this because we have an election coming up within a year, and the importance of the vote, the importance of registering if you're not registered, I think is so foundational, such an important first step for any other sense of agency, any other sense of identity. And yet the most disenfranchised, you could draw a line, it's the most disenfranchised that don't vote, that aren't registered. For some it's apathy, but for many it's also, I think it's 9 million people are not registered to vote that could vote. So these are massive figures of people that have been disenfranchised. And I understand the frustrations, the limitations. I hinted a bit to that, and reasons why people might not vote. But to lose the little bit of power that we have and not vote, to me, is shameful.
Yes. So moving on to your role as senior advisor with the NGO Care International, both here and in Ethiopia. Can you tell us about the mission and priorities that might, in that role, align with those of WILPF?
So it was set up, interestingly, it was set up just after the Second World War by people in the States making packages, care packages they were called, for Europe, for people in Europe that had suffered from the Second World War. So including in the UK, there's some people that received care packages. And it morphed from that to looking at other demands, needs around the world, and is now very much Southern focused. Its mission is to save lives, defeat poverty, and achieve social justice. I've been working with care for about, I think, 17 years now, so quite a long time as one of the hats that I've had. And I think it does some amazing work, and it's very much focused on women, which is obviously why I'm so keen on it. But one of the depressing things for me has been that with the work in Ethiopia, which is one of my areas of focus, I was talking to the country rep the other day, and she said that she estimated that although in the past 70% of the work was developmental and 30% was emergency, it's now the other way around. 70% of the work is emergency and 30% of the work is development. And the same happens right throughout care, is that, and in terms of international development more generally, that 30 years ago, there was a fair amount of long-term development work happening. Now it's crisis after crisis after crisis after crisis. And there are crises that you don't hear about in the countries that are not on the media, but where the intervention that is being requested is humanitarian and not long-term development. So I think a depressing sense of where the world has moved or not moved over the last 30 years, my active career in international development. I wish I could say that things had got better in that period, and I can't. They're bits of it, some of the understandings of some issues, including issues of understanding, you know, the white dominance and the colonial legacy of a lot of international development, which is now talked about in a way that it wasn't, and some other things we could point to. But overall, I do have a lot of disappointment with the way the world has moved over those 30 years or so.
Interesting about the being set up after the Second World War, because Save the Children was set up by WILPF women at the after the end of the First World War, because of the starvation that was happening in Europe. But yes, I like the point about the colonial legacy, and maybe other people might want to pick up on any of these things. You'll feel free, if something comes up that you want to question as it's coming up, to put your hand up or put your question into the chat. Now, we've made a point of talking about human rights, because all our work in WILPF is underpinned by human rights. And this is the weekend of United Nations Human Rights Day and 75th anniversary of the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. 25th of November was the beginning of the 16 days of action against violence against women. All WILPF's work is underpinned by human rights. What would you like to say your thoughts about addressing human rights as a feminist?
Yeah, for me, they are obviously interlinked. You know, the one is the Hillary Clinton statement about the two. And I think that the framing around human rights is very powerful for a lot of work. It universalizes, it takes it away from some of the discourses which are at a lower level, less strategic level of thinking. However, again, the whole framing of the Universal Rights Declarations can be accused of having a Western perspective. And I think they need to be brought, I think the human rights framework on its own will not influence a lot of people who are skeptical of it, not just for the reason I've just mentioned, but because of, let's put it this way, conservative leaning thinking. I'm thinking about the legislation around refugees, etc., at the moment in the UK. I'm also thinking of a conversation. Well, there was a event at Manchester Metropolitan University. I feel like saying last night, but I think it wasn't last night. It was the night before last, where we were looking at, and the speaker was Claire Ingalls from Fertility Matters, who was looking at the issues of around reproductive rights and IVF treatment, and the way the workplace often doesn't understand and doesn't support women going through the whole fertility treatment area. And she was saying, you know, this is a human right, and more people are going through fertility issues. I think 1 in 6 in some contexts is the figure. And what she was arguing, and what the conversations was around the fact that businesses are traditionally thinking about the work in terms of people coming in, you know, at 9 o'clock, leaving at 5 o'clock, the lunch break, working in the same place forever. And the reality is that people's lives are rhythmic, and organizations need to be thinking about that. And if you just work the traditional ways, nothing will work anymore. And COVID, for example, has created massive shifts. Bear with me, there is a logic to this, but it's a long one. COVID created massive shifts in the ways companies worked, and the Generation Z Gen Z will expect not just working for home and flexible working for reasons to do with convenience, but also for understanding life cycle related issues. You know, you might have fertility issues, you might have all sorts of pains and problems that are not recognized. You might go in and out of having children and then back to work. And that flexibility in work is a new reality. So she was arguing partly it's a human right, the human right to understand people in their complexity rather than a traditional view where humans and work are not really understood. But that flexibility is going to be demanded more and more. But then also, the conversation was around the business logic of understanding where people are at and the costs of not doing it, the costs of inflexibility. And I think what I'm coming to is a human rights framework is really important as a backdrop to how you think, but the pragmatic rationale around the costs of not doing the right thing, the economic costs of not doing the right thing, the well-being costs of not doing the right thing, the human costs of not doing the right thing might also be really powerful arguments alongside the abstract way in which human rights language sometimes falls. I don't know whether any of that made sense to you. It's a slightly convoluted story, but I'm hoping that it might have resonated with some of you.
Yes, very much so. It very much an around, and maybe people want to come back to that later. It can't have escaped anyone's, or maybe it has escaped some people's awareness that COP28, the United Nations Climate Change Conference, has been taking place in Dubai this week and goes on next week. And some very interesting reports, and there's a lot of activists there, including a delegation from WILPF that has been very involved in linking militarism with the climate crisis. As an activist for climate justice, what projects are you involved in that impact particularly on women and girls?
Some of the work that I do and care is around water sanitation provision. A lot of that is around resilience to water-related shocks and to hygiene and sanitation-related vulnerabilities as well. And I've been involved with a few other projects, some interesting ones looking at the nexus between forestry, livelihood, and women's economic and reproductive rights. All of this is in Ethiopia, and it's attempts to work on the ground to address real problems, but also to think about not doing so in silos. You know, often when you think about forestry, it tends to be thinking about the trees, often not the livelihoods. So looking at trees and livelihoods. And then when you're thinking about trees and livelihoods, you're often not looking at it from a gendered lens. And then you're not looking at it from a women's reproductive rights related issues. So a lot of development is compartmentalized. And that project, for example, is trying not to. And then I've been involved a bit in advocacy related issues. So around the International Day of the Girl, we did something with Newsround to raise awareness of climate-related issues in schools. But I kid you not, the awareness in the schools was just so amazing, and their ability to talk about the different types of problems that could emerge and the activism that the actions that they could take were just so inspiring. I came away from that whole process very impressed. Been a little bit involved with media related issues as well, linked to trying to raise awareness on climate related issues and the COP opportunity, particularly around the Agenda Day last Monday, or this Monday. Monday's just gone.
Thank you. On to, in your book, deeds, not words, which of course the phrase, and in case anyone doesn't recognize it, comes from the suffrage period. The story of women's rights then and now, which you've written, you discussed the connection between gender inequality and violence at a personal and global level and linked to militarism. This link, as I mentioned before, is one of WILPF's major themes, and the theme of women, peace and security, which of course is a United Nations Security Council resolution. What actions can be taken to address violence against women as a result of the ever-increasing conflicts around the world? Because it always seems to be on the increase.
Yeah. Really interested in all of your thoughts. So maybe when we come to the Q&A session, please do, if you've got comments as well as questions, we'd lovely to hear those. You started by asking about the politics and whether the kind of political engagement, the vote made sense, and I argued that it did. In the book, I look at the different chapters and I score them. So how far have we got in terms of politics, in terms of economics, in terms of social change, in terms of violence, in terms of culture, and so on. Yeah, those are the 5. And I thought that by scoring each of the chapters and by encouraging the audience, when I do talks as well, or when people are reading, asking them to score, have we moved more in terms of economic change that we have in political, or have we moved more in terms of cultural issues, or what? Where's the progress been greatest and where has it been least? And the area that in my book I felt we'd progressed the least of all of the areas is around violence. And when I talk to people and I ask them to vote, so I ask them, I say, put your hands up and, say for out of 5 for politics, for example, what is it? And people usually put their fingers up. It's about 3 or 4. And then you can have interesting conversations with those who are voting, who are saying it's a 1, and those who are saying it's a 4. And often it's personal experiences that might result in that. But generally, the overall consensus around politics is around 3. Economics is around 3. With violence, it's usually a 1. The average is usually a 1. Sometimes it's a 0. And this is people reflecting not that there haven't been attempts at it, there haven't been policy changes, but that the reality is every single woman and every single girl has a curfew about where and when they can be in ways that men don't. Or when men are concerned, it's in specific places, and it's not gender-based violence. It's violence by men. Not to say there isn't gender-based violence with women as perpetrator, but it's such a tiny, tiny bit of the wider story. So that fact that male violence against women or male violence against men is still so globally all-pervasive, and if anything, in some ways is getting worse and is morphing because of internet and online abuse, is incredibly depressing. I'm an optimist, and I don't like some of the things I'm saying, because I would so much prefer to say, the world is getting better, we are making a difference, we're campaigning together, we're out on the streets, we're doing whatever we're doing, and things are getting better, but they're not. So what's the solution? I don't know, and this is where maybe the conversation that we can all have together is important. And I will have some calls to action at the end, but just at this point to say this is really hard and it's not getting easier. And all of you will have the conflicts that you're aware of in the world going on at the moment at the back of your minds as you're listening to this, and it's horrifying.
Thank you for that. Moving on to some of your other hats, what can you tell us about your work, and there have been references earlier, to get equal representation for women in Parliament, and of course upcoming elections and voting and so on?
So I'm involved in, one of my hats is as convener of something called Centenary Action. If you Google it afterwards, you can find out more. But we were set up in 2018 because of a sense that although there was some organizations looking at the issue of political representation, there wasn't that much, nor was there a coalition bringing people together. So we thought, okay, well, let's bring people together specifically with a target between 2018, the centenary of some women getting the vote, and 2028, centenary of equal franchise, over 10 years, just 10 years, saying, can we shift the needle in some way and use those two centenaries as the start and end point. And we're a coalition with lots of different organizations involved, WI, Sir Optimist, Mums Net, Muslim Women's Network, quite a lot of ones. WILPF isn't, as far as I know, and it would be great if you did join us. And critically, the political wings of the parties, so Women to Win, Women's Labour Network, etc. And what we are doing collectively, in a way, is creating a feminist ecosystem that is shining a spotlight on the political system, particularly on the barriers to women entering and staying in Parliament. And we're working around three barriers. One is the violence one. As just mentioned, it permeates and infiltrates and corrodes everything else. Secondly, economic barriers. They are bigger obviously, they're greater for women than they are to men, especially to bring in minoritized women. And thirdly, the culture and the practices within Parliament. So we're looking at those three, and we're working together to try and push the needle in a number of different ways. For example, there was an Elect Her fund for disabled women to help cover some of the costs of candidates, costs which are greater for disabled people around, say, wheelchair access and sign language, etc. And the fund was put aside, and we're campaigning for it to be brought back in. And it looks very positive, but that's one campaign. A number of others. The one that we're focusing on the most at the moment is to try and get transparency around the selection process. And we're looking at and logging the candidates that are being selected. This is because there is so little transparency around the selection of candidates, and there is very little data. We're also pushing for the parties to commit to Section 106 of the Equality Act, which, if enacted, would force all parties to provide that data in the way that they're not at the moment. We're pretty convinced that we will be able to get that. So by the next, in the next Parliament, that act will be, that section of the Equalities Act will be put in place. But we've been campaigning, pushing for it, and hopefully we will achieve that. We've focused on, at the beginning of this talk, we talked about women voting, and I made that point that it's the first step of agency in that political space of engaging in the public world, which obviously is also linked to the domestic world, but it's that first step. And that goes through to being politically involved in your communities and wider communities, in nationally, etc., through to political representation. In the Centenary Action, we're focusing on candidates and the political space. So at the furthest end rather than at the beginning. However, with the elections coming up, and there'll be two elections before 2028. So with this election and with the next election, we're also really, really interested in work around engaging women to vote, engaging minoritized people to vote, because it's important for our democracy, but also because it's the first step of that political engagement to all the other things down the line. And by the way, women are 51% of the electorate. There are also fewer women in prison than there are men in prison. Prisoners can't vote. Therefore, there are more women for that reason as well, which I think is a rather funny little aside, but also just worth noting. and even more important than all of that, women are swing voters. They make their minds proportionately much later on. Therefore, political parties should be targeting them and thinking about what women want, and women should be expressing what they want. And the statistics show us that on average, there are differences, there are gender-based differences between what women prioritize and what men prioritize. So with greater awareness of politicians of the importance of women's vote, and with the greater importance of women of their vote, I think something interesting could happen. And one last point on this, which is that it's also that women, as a generalization, are often less party political. They're more political. They're less vested in a single party. Not everybody. Some people are, tied to the hip with a particular party, but many, many women are not. And again, that speaks to collaboration across parties. That speaks to the possibility of doing things slightly differently, because my view is if we had more women voting, if we had more politicians understanding the power of women's vote and thinking about what that means, and if we had better representation, we would get better politics and we would get fewer of the horrors that we do have at the moment. And a quick caveat, that's not to say that all women will do wonderful things. This essentializing of men and women as different is problematic, but it's also, as a general rule, also interesting and important.
That was very interesting. Some very interesting points raised there about women's actual agency in the field of politics. I noticed particularly you didn't mention anything like 50-50 representation or any of that, but you more focused on underlying themes. Thank you. That's very good. Now, moving on, do you want to tell us something about what's happening in Manchester with GM4women2028?
Yeah.
Go on.
Very, very briefly, if any of you are in Manchester, please look up GM4women2028. It's a coalition looking at the data in terms of the lives of women and girls, again, using those 10 years. We're linked a lot with the universities, but also civil society organizations and others. And we are trying to put the spotlight on data, and the data is not changing massively over the 10 years. We had 10 indicators, which we were tracking over 10 years, and then briefs underneath it to look at issues around politics, economics, violence, culture and active lives, and education. And it was started because of a comment that Andy Burnham made about wanting to make Manchester the best place for women and girls. And I said, how do we measure that? And that led to this beginning of this initiative. And my summary would be that I think there's the political will in Greater Manchester. There's a lot of initiatives, but the reality is that the data is still not going in an upward direction in terms of many of the key indicators. COVID put a spanner in the works, obviously, in terms of a lot of things.
Right. And you are a professor at Manchester Metropolitan University, and the first Chancellor of the University of Suffolk. Can you link those roles in academia with WILPF's work?
Well, I think that the whole link to universities and young people thinking and engaging in the world is really important, and engaged scholarship, for me, the link between academia and research, the link between activism and academia is multifaceted and really, really important. It's about who comes through the system, the students that are coming through the system at a point at which they're reflecting on the world. And it's about what is studied and how that can inform, questions around freedom and safety and, internationalism versus localism and all the key issues that you are engaging with. And for me personally, I felt that I wanted to understand different places and people. I grew up in Ethiopia. Ethiopian international development is very much part of who I am, but the Manchester and the Suffolk, and I live in Hertfordshire, but the Manchester and Suffolk links were partly to understand other local realities, and that link between the local to the global, which again is part of what you are all about, I think is really interesting and really important.
We hear a lot about the restrictions on courses in universities, and the closing of courses relating to the arts and so on. Have you got experience of that? And how do you feel that students are being, as it were, constrained within tram lines, as it were, in the current education system?
Yeah, again, I'm going to say things are getting worse, and I hate doing this, but the whole funding model of universities is majorly problematic. It doesn't add up. And therefore, the universities are streamlining what they are putting forward to students, and lots of areas of interest are going by the wayside. And some of it's even earlier. So I went to Sussex University initially, and when I went to Sussex, and I studied economics and development. Basically, at the time, the university was divided into schools. So I was in AFRAS, African and Asian School, or you could be in the European school, or you could be in the American school, and I forget what the others were. And the point about that was that I studied economics in the African and Asian school, and I also studied philosophy. I studied Kenyan literature. I studied the politics of, I forget where. So there was a interdisciplinary but regional focus. And likewise, the people in America studied, they might have been doing philosophy, but they also did a bit of economics about America, et cetera, et cetera. And that cross-disciplinary, interdisciplinary approach was brilliant. Sussex is no longer divided up into schools like that, and there's hardly any interdisciplinary teaching in universities in that way. And that, that's icing on the interdisciplinary stuff. It's icing on the cakes. It's even certain subjects not being taught anymore that's the problem. Studying languages at a GCSE level now is apparently something that's increasingly not happening. So again, given your interests and mine, people not studying other languages is heartbreaking. But I want to be an optimist, and I want to be saying positive things to you all here.
Well, here's your chance. We're coming towards a conclusion. And in the spirit of deeds, not word, it would be good to leave participants, although we're not leaving yet, and we will have the chance of many questions from you. It would be good to direct us towards the sort of things that we might be doing. Is there some action that we could take, whether it's just a postcard or what?
So if we link to, I'm sure you're involved in campaigns within WILPF already, and I think that just showing up and caring and being that voice of possibility and international collaboration is incredibly important. So let me start with the power of what you're doing, the power of another vision of where the world could be and how it could operate. The local to the global, I mentioned that before, and I think it's really important, really, really important that we don't think one or the other, that we think one and the other. And environmentalists are often very aware of this, that you do things in your own space, but you also are so aware that that there are global inequalities, and your situation might be so much better than others, and the responsibility and the historic responsibility of all of that, but that we have to think global but also act local. If any of you are interested in what I'm doing, please think about joining Centenary Action as a member. If any of you are in Greater Manchester, please look up Greater Manchester. And then the most important thing, vote, 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 vote. Encourage others to vote. And that is a journey. So it's voting, but then it's looking whether you want to be involved as a local councillor or on boards or in any other political engagement, because I think that was the point of it all. That was why they started with it.
Amazing. Yes, that's the way. Great. So many things that you've drawn our attention to. But I'm absolutely sure that people out there have got things they want to get you to elaborate on or question. So the floor is very much open to you. There are questions in the chat. Maybe we could start there.
Shall we start with Julie's point, if she would like to talk about it? I mean, I'm reading, it's fascinating, but I don't know whether that works.
Go ahead, Julie. Are you there?
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, that's good. It was 5 o'clock in the morning in central Queensland. So when I started, so I'm lying in bed. So this is why you've got my old lady image instead of my face. I actually grew up in New Zealand, where there was first past the post voting in those days, and it's very much more complicated there now with Indigenous seats and all that kind of thing. But in Australia, I actually find that our complicated system of preferential voting can actually get us some total duds, and it doesn't necessarily get us very many women. So I'm unsure how we can change, our voting system. So ours is compulsory; you have to come in. So a lot of people come in like it's this chore, this duty they have to do. They don't read anything, they don't know anything. And whatever rubbish has been on social media is what, is the person they vote for or vote against. I think in Australia, more likely you vote against a party or a candidate than you do for. I really don't know what the answer to this is. And is there any? I'd like to know from other women. I went to university in my 30s for the first time, being a working class Kiwi, had no chances when I was young. And I did politics and economics, and I just felt like it was a complete waste of my time, because nothing had changed from when I was young. And now I don't find that anything has improved either. And I want some hope. I need some hope in my old age that things are going to change. But I don't know how to go about it. And I'm looking at all these women who obviously have a lot of experience. What do you think? I want to know what other people think of how we can actually develop a system or use the systems we've got to work better for us, for women, for the environment. I'm also a greenie and environmental scientist. I'm bamboozled as to how we can I don't know. I don't know if it's controlling capitalism or controlling ignorance or whatever. So anyone else's feedback, please.
Well, the floor's open. Who wants to address that? No hands. Helen?
I mean, yeah, if not, let me just say, I think thanks for calling out. There isn't a simple answer to it, you know, that first past the post is problematic. I don't think any place would start with that now. So if there was any new body, I don't think that anybody would go for first past the post anymore. I think it had its time. And if you look at the devolved systems, in Wales, Northern Ireland, and in Scotland, they are, well, I'm not sure about Northern Ireland because that's never functioning, so one forgets about it, unfortunately. But definitely with Wales and Scotland, it's not a first past the post system. And then the many other institutions set up since have not been as well. But I hear you that it's far from perfect in Australia, and it's complicated in New Zealand as well. So imperfect it may be, but it's what we've got. And I think it's no excuse in the UK to put your hands up and say, woe is us, the system doesn't work very well, because you're relinquishing the little bit of control that you have, the little bit of your piece of the jigsaw puzzle. And that makes it even worse and dangerous, very dangerous.
Any other ideas? Go on, Paula.
Very briefly, I think quite a few years ago, we started having citizenship in primary schools. And there was the idea that it would run through in secondary. We'd actually have some political education, because I think it needs to start early and have a commitment to it, not necessarily compulsory, but with peace education and citizenship, we might actually end up with some decent people.
And that speaks maybe to Kate's point about, you know, how can we convince people to that their votes really counts. I think that education is important. And I think the danger of not, you know, the point that those people who are least likely to vote are those people who are most marginalized, and therefore you're giving power to the most powerful by not voting. It is, for me, the strongest point. Jo's got her hands up.
Jo, yes.
Hi, I'm very new to this organisation, so I genuinely don't know. But I'm someone who belongs to a charity that does campaign work in Parliament, and I guess speaking to the question that was just responded to, I also can see and have experience of how charities that supposedly represent women are actually not upholding their voices particularly well, and I find it quite demoralising. And I guess I'm almost curious how you form a collective so that you can campaign successfully to change, because there's definitely obstacles within Parliament. And I mean, I wasn't in a paid role, but it was quite a shock to my system to see the reality of how things operate, and in a way the disinterest from some MPs about experiences. So I don't know much about what you do and how you campaign, but I'd be curious to hear.
Jo, thank you so much, and do please follow up if you're interested with Centenary Action, and you can contact me directly as well, you know, through that, or find me somehow, you will, LinkedIn or whatever, because I'd be interested to talk more. But it's hard. So it's hard for a number of reasons. One is that it's cross-party. And if you try and bring Women to Win, which is the Conservative Party's organisation, and Labour Women's Network, and a number of others together, or women MPs to speak in these collaborative spaces, their instinct is to do party first, a woman being a woman second. And what we're trying to do is flip that when they're in our spaces, to say, you know, let's focus on your interest as women together, because the whole of the party system, the whole of Parliament, functions according to party divisions, and we're not going to shift the whole thing unless we can start looking at it in a different way. So it's hard because of that. It's hard because for conservative women in the coalition, it's hard because they're arguing against their own party. So anything that we say, they find particularly difficult because they are the ones in power. For those organizations that are not so we're working both with civil society organizations and with these organizations that are based in Parliament. And there's some schisms between those a little bit, because one don't quite know how the others operate, and one lot want to be more sometimes more simplistic in the arguments that they're saying, so all we need is this, and those involved in Parliament will say, hang on a minute, that's been tried 10 times and it could be like this or it could be like that. So I think what I'm saying is it's hard, but it's so much more powerful and so much more fun actually working together than trying to do it on your own. And I just don't think you can succeed being very narrow-minded about a single with a single organization on a single approach. Or maybe you can, but it's just not the way I feel comfortable operating. I don't think it's as effective. But Jo, would be really interested to hear more about your experiences.
Yes, thanks. I'll get in touch. Thanks.
Valerie. You're muted, Valerie.
Thank you. I recently read about the huge amount of money accessible to one party compared with others. I expect you can guess which one it was, but it seems to me a fatal inequality if there's no limit to the amount of money that can be spent on an election.
Yep. And there's so much else that's majorly problematic. The tabling of when you speak and how long you can speak is controlled by government in the most ridiculous way, etc., etc. There's a brilliant book by hang on, I'm just going to get it one sec. Oh no, I can't. It's upstairs. It's called How Parliament Works and Why It Doesn't. And it is very good at illustrating the structural problems with our Parliament and the cultural problems with it. And then there's a chapter at the end with suggestions, and getting those suggestions through, getting change is going to be really, really difficult. The whole trend is against the democratic values that we would want to see flourishing in many ways. And here we go again, another depressive point.
Who's next?
Len?
Yeah. Angie?
Yeah, hi there. There's so many sort of threads that one wants to kind of untangle and pull at, because they all seem interwoven. You talk about voting and you talk about the parliamentary system, and then someone came in about education. And I'm a creative arts therapist and from New Zealand, and now living in the UK. But for me, working with very traumatized children from families who are so disenfranchised for a variety of reasons. And how do we get people in? It's almost like actually we need the basics, we need poverty to go. So now we suddenly look at the avenue of capitalism. Oh, and so actually, are we looking at something really big, the whole big paradigm that needs tipping on its head? I'm an ex-teacher, and I can tell you we are teaching in such a rigid way in 2023. I am in despair about it. So yes, let's bring in teaching peace and politics in there. Let's teach about respect and sex and all those things. But we're not. No, we've got national standards. We're doing this and that. So it's almost like this. What's the intersection where we say things need to be turned on their heads? I mean, I think these crises are pushing us towards that. So I'm a little bit of the thing that I can fall into despair. You know, I was working with these children, I'd be crying on my way home, but I'm almost at the point of saying, bring it on, because the more it erupts, almost, this is very objective, the more it erupts, the more there will be the call for change. And I do think there's something really important about us gathering. I think, Helen, you mentioned gathering. You know, it's almost like, yes, it can seem a little bit, you know, you're not, what are you doing when you gather? But actually to gather at Parliament or to gather at a school place and say, we require change, 2023, and it's got to be different for our young people. It's got to be different for us. I don't know if that made any sense whatsoever, but it's like, it just seems so layered, so intertwined. To pull one thing is very hard. Yeah.
It made a lot of sense. I love that kind of focus on the gathering. On the point about eruption, and I've often felt this as well, you know, do we just need to chuck the whole thing and start again? The problem with eruptions is that they are violent and they're dangerous. And also, you can't just wait and contribute to the problem because you want the whole thing to erupt and go away. You have to do your bit. You have to do your work with the kids that you're working with. So the gathering, I think, is really powerful.
I think the gathering can be, and this is when, you know, I mean, this group in particular is related to peace, isn't it? I was back in New Zealand, and I don't want to get, you know, into sides about things, but we had your British person come over, Rosie Parker, is it? I don't know. She's quite, anyway, and there was a huge protest in New Zealand around it, and it was very loud and noisy, and things could have kicked off. And it was just the sense, I thought, oh, I just want to hum. Can't we all go back to the sector where we hold some hands together and we hum and we say, let's just be, where's our humanity? And there's a little bit of calling of that. So I think the gathering is important. If we say we come together in peace, you know, and how do we do that in an active way of peace? Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Lynn, are you?
Yes, I think I'm unmuted.
Yes, go ahead.
Helen, wonderful to hear what you said, but I just want to give a small glimmer of hope. So here in Australia, it's worthwhile a little study of the Teal campaign. So in our last federal elections, we had 6 women stand in blue ribbon seats on an independent teal platform. They called it teal because it was a mixture. They really came from very conservative fiscal electorates, and they stood, so it was a mixture of that and green for environment. So they had a very much a mix of the two, hence the name teal. But these 6 women got elected, which was just incredible. So there was significant swings in their electorates, and previously they had been absolutely solid conservative liberal seats, and in actual fact 2 of the seats had been held by former conservative prime ministers. So we're talking about hardcore. These 6 women got elected into the parliament, and it's really been quite interesting 18 months out watching how the dynamics, particularly around collaboration. You know, yes, the government depends on their vote, or they need voter, they or the other independents, but there's glimmers of hope. These 6 women, they're being listened to. So it's just we're very much a Westminster system like you are, and it's a blokey place, but we're breaking through. But it's really a worthwhile case study to look at. I guess the test will be the re-election factor in another 18 months' time. But I just wanted to share that. It hasn't yet got up to the state where Julie lives. So it was the southern, down south states that brought the women in, and one in Western Australia. But I just wanted to share it as a glimmer of hope. And it's taken years, as you would know, Helen, of work on that to just start changing the mindsets. So thank you.
Brilliant. Really good to hear.
Do they answer to their constituency? How are they drawing on the ideas that elected them?
Helen, and Sheila, they're very much constituency focused. So they actually do go back, and I've been following 3 of them in particular just to see how it goes. And they hold regular meetings like back in their electorates. And when they speak in Parliament, they say, this is how my constituency, and even the ones where they've got the, that hardcore liberal, they're still able to bring, particularly I think they pick up more on a bit of, we've had quite a bit around climate and that, so they're quite strong on bringing that through. So yes, is their constituency 100% behind them? Probably not, but they at least are showing a model that gives hope to take things forward. And we've also got one independent young man who was elected, which was a surprise, and he's very much a strong environmentalist, but he was also an international footballer. So you can imagine that drew, the football bit got all the attention, but he has just got some very solid climate credentials, and he has positioned himself that the government are listening. So there's a glimmer of hope down here. We just need to continue it.
Oh, and Len, we need to explain to the British people that liberal in Australia actually means conservative, because all things are relative. Yes, yeah, blue. They're liberal because
yeah. So it is. They're hardcore conservative, I can assure you. Or they were, yes. Or the electorates were, their electorates were, but not these 6 amazing women aren't.
Teal.
Helen Martins.
Thank you, Helen, for amazing whiz through 100 years of campaigning. I really enjoyed that. You mentioned next year's general election, and one of the things that WILPF will be doing will be to develop a manifesto to raise awareness with prospective parliamentary candidates. So I guess we should really look at Centenary Action, which sounds interesting. But if there's one important thing that you think we should really focus on, it'd be really interesting to hear that.
I made the mistake of Manchester trying to do 2 things at once, which is answer the question, one of the questions I saw in the chat box. So I've just done that, which is providing information. So it was about really sorry, Helen, can you ask me the question again?
I can. So talking about next year's general election here in the UK, one of the things that WILPF is going to do is to produce a manifesto so that we can raise awareness and have discussions with prospective candidates. And I think we should probably be linking up with Centenary Action, which you mentioned, which sounds interesting. But if there's one really important message that we think we should address in our manifesto, it'd be great to hear that. Thank you.
Thanks, Helen. Yes, let's definitely link up. We are, a number of organisations are leading with this idea of the kind of feminist ecosystems around the election, and Fawcett's very much involved, 50-50 Parliament are involved, we are involved, CARE's involved, and then the wider organisations that we're linked into. I'll just take you on a little bit of an aside, but one of the things I realised is that the coalition was social movements and civil society focused, and we hadn't really engaged with business. So we're now, and yet, this is a long little aside. How are we on time?
We're okay on time.
Okay, let me give you a little spiel, which is that Parliament holds business to account, for example, through gender pay gap reporting, which is that any organisation that has more than 250 staff has to report on what's happening with the gender pay gap. But actually, Parliament's HR system and its own gender story is appalling. So what would happen if we got the best of business, which is way ahead of Parliament in terms of its HR systems, in terms of its attitudes to gender, often women-led organisations? They're doing really interesting things. What would happen if we got them to, if they held Parliament to account on gender issues? We also know that men historically have, businessmen and men in politics went to the same schools, they know each other, they're linked up, or they went to the same clubs and things like that, in a way that women in business or in Parliament haven't linked up that much. So there's a fear, there's a bit of a fear. Women MPs are slightly scared of women business at the top of the business world, and women at the top of the business world don't really understand politics and are slightly scared of women in politics. So what happens if we could create links between those? What happens if business used the power of its linkages to think about ensuring that its employees were registered to vote and voted, and gave people time off on the voting day to vote? What happens if there was kind of awareness in businesses about the importance of voting? And can we pull in businesses into this space of engaging in the election? And I think we can, and we are trying to, and we're starting to. So for those of you who know businesses that are really well run, with strong women involved who might, and I'm saying strong women, strong feminists, anybody who might be interested in this agenda, please let me know. Because it's the very early stages of thinking these coalitions need to cut across the divide that's often there between business and civil society. So to your point, Helen, please join us, please help us if you can in this idea about finding the non-traditional partners in these coalitions to ensure that we minimize the number of people who can't vote, to ensure that we thereby minimize the number of people who don't feel that they have a political agency, which can lead them onto journeys of political engagement in so many other ways. I mean, I could make other recommendations, but for me, that one around starting people on a political journey is the most important. So anything that you do, it's not so much the content of the manifesto. I think it's the getting people to care and getting people to be there on the day and to encourage others to go on the day. And then sorry, the last point is that we will be creating something collaboratively around what the key asks should be to the parties, given the power of the female vote. So we can work together on that, on the creating the feminist national and international policies.
Thank you.
I'm a bit worried to hear you say, let business lead on this. I mean, these could well be the same businesses that don't pay attention to the trade unions in their organization, or don't allow, in some cases of business, don't allow trade union organization. Have you more comments on that?
So I think that there's business and there's business. There's business at the worst end and there's business at the best end. And the best end of business is better than Parliament. No doubt about it, in terms of the flexibilities of their policies, et cetera, and they are powerful. So I think my statement is, let's harness their power and their better policies to put pressure on Parliament. And if we can create enough power amongst organizations, businesses that see that they have a responsibility to encourage their staff to vote, then we are doing the political system a service. We're not going to resolve the problem that businesses are majorly problematic in many other ways, but trade unions are involved in the whole voting space. They know it's important. They're engaging in it. And they can fight the fight, and we, with other agendas, can fight the fight about transforming the worst parts of businesses. But let's not forget a really important ally that exists, which are these amazing businesses.
Who wants to carry on the conversation? Yes, Kate?
Are you able, Helen, to mention one or two of the businesses? Because I'm intrigued and I'd like to know who they are, that we can have faith in them.
So one of the reasons why I'm saying that is, for example, the 30% Club, which was set up by Helen Morrissey a while ago and now has got others involved. They set it up as a coalition to try and get boards to have more than 30% women, and they are now, I think they're going to 40% because they've more than achieved the 30%. The one, so I'm working with a couple that I'm not sure whether I think I better not name the individual organizations. I'm not quite sure why I'm reticent, but I think it's partly because it's so early in our development about how to do this. But what I do know is, if you look at, and there's an interesting organization called, I think it's called Lead 50/50, that does maps of the companies that are, it's really interesting actually. It charts the companies that are better at addressing the gender pay gap than others, and you can see which sectors are better and which organizations are better, and they do a top 10 analysis of those that are particularly good in terms of gender pay gap related issues by sector and so on. So that's a good place for a lot of information.
Thank you.
Let me put a generalization. It's an unfair one, but when you've got women-led organizations, you will usually get better HR and better systems of the culture within organizations. Not always, but a lot of the times. It's the same for politics. You'll get awful women in politics as well. So I don't want to, having essentialized and generalized awfully, but still there is something there.
We've still got a few minutes. If anyone has something they want to raise. So much concentration on Parliament and voting. I'm thinking about some of the other issues that that we concentrate on, a lot more international issues, particularly around climate justice and having a women's voice in those international fora.
I was just gonna, I don't know how to phrase this as a question. This might just end up being a bit of a stream of consciousness. But I guess with our lobbying, we tend to come back to human rights and what we emphasize, like these are all the, this is all the legislation. Look at like the ESHR, like all these things that we're leaving, and human rights is so fundamental. And you mentioned earlier how actually maybe do we need to rethink our strategizing and think about well, who are we talking to when we're trying to get them to consider and say, well, if we're kind of trying to lobby a conservative government, why don't we talk about how this will economically affect them rather than trying to draw on their moral and ethical compass? I wonder whether that's maybe something that we do need to consider, but then does that feel like we're losing the sense of who we are, because ultimately we are trying to emphasize and center human rights and individual equality and stuff. I don't know, a bit of an open-ended one, really.
Yes, I don't know. It's important questions, tactics versus kind of moral vision and moral compass. Really, really difficult, but I think be aware of how it lands.
Are there some, I'm trying to see if there are any questions in the chat that we haven't addressed. Can anyone see anything? Did you have your hand up, Jan?
I did. Shall I say what I was? It came up earlier in the evening.
Yes, sure.
Masculinity and violence in the context of war and peace. And it does seem to me as though one looks at the news and you can see, healthy, well-fed young men with immensely expensive weapons, just destroying the lives of largely women and children and older people. And yet that's never mentioned, that this terrible gender inequality expressed in war. I mean, I'm not quite sure what to do about it, but I do think to myself about Maud Molam and what, brilliant job she did in Northern Ireland. And maybe there should be some international sort of norm that, you send your women to make peace. I just don't know that would work better, but it does seem to me there's something that isn't spoken of, but yet is so very obvious when every time you look at the news, the violence that men inflict on women and children in the name of war.
Very, very good point.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's something else going on around the narrative that then forces of women and children together as the victims. So you're silent about the fact that the violence is being perpetrated by men. You're just talking about the violence. You're talking about women as the victims. You're always talking about women as the victims. And this is because war often does that, but it's also because, I mean, take Gaza and Israel, you've got two leadership systems at the extreme on both sides of being patriarchal and not seeing women's agency in any positive, favorable way. So their ideology is then being replicated by the whole world in how it sees the situation. And as you said, there's no local or global vision that actually women have historically always played a role in peace making, and that could be something that they could take up. But because of the politics of how all of this is placed and the images of how it's responded to, we are all then talking about women as victims, and that's it.
Yes, and I mean, I think also women, they lose so much, and yet they're not allowed the role to express that huge loss, the price. I mean, I don't like to be sort of, men are like this and women are like that, but there is a sense in which women lose, and there's no way in which their loss, which they anticipate or they're experiencing, can be expressed in really serious peacemaking.
Well, that's why we have a whole stream of United Nations resolutions, starting from the Security Council Resolution 1325, which talks about women having agency in peacemaking and peace building and being listened to in the resolution of conflict. And we in WILPF are always invoking it. We, from the very start, where we had a role in this resolution being passed at the Security Council in the year 2000. And it's a known fact that conflicts that have women in the teams that are working for the resolution, those agreements, those treaties or whatever, have a stronger and notably greater chance and reason to remain and survive. Like you were mentioning, Momolan, at the earlier when you were asking, there are teams, there are people addressing conflict resolution. They are often headed up by or bringing in women. It's often that the main agents among the perpetrators have so much difficulty. They're so embedded in their patriarchy that they have so much difficulty in coming to a table where women are present or women are engaged. It's something that WILPF is absolutely central to working on.
That's terrific. Can I just make one final suggestion, which is when we get the the correspondents out there on the interviewing people who are involved in conflict, they never ask the question, where are the women in the peacemaking process? What's the engagement of women? And I'm sure you'll do your best to make them say that, but let's try and urge them to assume that women have a part to play in making peace and to ask that question.
Well, that's why we have an organization like the United Nations. That's why these resolutions are passed, so that those countries that sign up are then held to account for what they've signed up to. I mean, it often amazes me that some of the major countries of the world and the richest have not signed up to some of the United Nations agreements, like, for instance, the death penalty or I mean, their whole the rights of the child and so on. America hasn't signed up to that because they consider that 16-year-olds are adults and therefore can be executed, and that is something that is against the United Nations rights of the child. There's so many of these things, if you look into them. We just do have to always hold these countries to account.
Yeah,
that's what we're around. That's what we're here for.
Go for it. Do it.
Maybe,
thank you.
Maybe that's a good note to end on. That there is a threat to internationalism right now. It's very, very strong. So a continued belief in it, maybe to the point about a modernizing of how we can make that relevance to young people so that they continue to understand the power of those international linkages. An understanding and a voicing of the masculinities underlying some of the problems around conflict. I think all of these things that you're doing and have long done since your formation, but continuing to think of how that lands and how that can be ever better communicated at a time when it continues to be needed more than ever. And then let's stay in touch. Let's think of ways in which we can work together, because there's a lot to be done.
Absolutely. And we're really, really grateful and stimulated by what you've led us through tonight. There's so much for us to think about. And tomorrow we're going to be on the streets, we're going to be in vigils, we're going to be marching, we're going to be standing up for the cessation of the most vile conflict that is currently going on. We need always to be there and to show what we can do. In London, you can be at vigil at Euston, and you can be, if you can't march, and you can march from Bank at 12 o'clock tomorrow. So hope you'll all be active. And anyone who doesn't know WILPF, look us up on the internet, and we're always looking for more support. Thank you all for your attendance and your contribution tonight. And thank you so much to Helen for leading us so well today. Thank you, Helen.
Thanks, everybody. Real pleasure.